The stars of the Calithian Empire glimmered like fading embers, each one a reminder of what had once been. Once their banners had stretched across entire galaxies, their fleets unmatched, their rulers feared and respected in equal measure. But time had worn away at their glory. Civilizations that had once bowed now stood free, and rivals whispered that the age of the Calithians was finally ending. What hurt more than lost worlds or scattered fleets was the slow death of their royal bloodline. In the towering palace of silver spires and glowing crystal, Princess Elira stood alone in her private chamber. She was the last of her line, draped in garments woven from light thread, her every step observed by unseen eyes and measured against endless tradition. Her face carried the proud, sharp features of her ancestors, but her eyes held a sadness she never showed in public. For centuries, the curse of her blood had been no secret. The royal line could not continue. No child had been born to her family in generations. The empire had become a throne without an heir, a crown resting on a head destined to be the last. Courtiers whispered in the hallways, their voices like snakes in the dark. Some said the gods had abandoned the Calithians. Others claimed the curse was punishment for arrogance. The truth mattered little. What mattered was that the empire had no future. Rivals grew bold, foreign powers circled, and even her own people questioned whether her reign, when it came, would mean anything at all. Elira's life was duty. Each morning began with ceremonies older than memory, rituals meant to remind the galaxy of her people's greatness. She greeted diplomats with a flawless smile, recited lines carved into memory since childhood, and carried herself as if the weight of 1,000 years did not press on her shoulders. Yet when the halls emptied, and she was left with silence, the facade cracked. She would walk to the wide balcony of her chamber and stare at the stars. There she would wonder how much longer she could carry the illusion that her people still had a future. Her advisors urged her to take symbolic steps, adopt heirs from noble families, marry into distant dynasties, pretend continuity, even if it was false. But Elira refused. To her, such acts would only be the final admission that the Calithians had become hollow. She clung to the faint hope that somehow the curse could be broken. Yet even she had begun to doubt. News came that humans, a young species from a small world called Earth, had risen quickly in the galactic stage. Compared to the ancient empires, they were newcomers, barely learning to travel between stars. But their growth was impossible to ignore. They fought wars and won against foes stronger than them. They survived in harsh worlds where other species had failed, and they spread with a stubbornness that baffled old civilizations. Some laughed at humans, calling them reckless children. Others feared that this same recklessness might one day change the balance of power. Now humans had sent a delegation to the Calithian court. The purpose was simple: trade agreements, cultural exchanges, and diplomatic ties. To Elira, it was just another task in a long list of duties. She expected humans to be no different from other envoys, dressed in finery, speaking carefully chosen words, bowing to tradition. But in the back of her mind, she was curious. Reports spoke of humans as unpredictable, a species that refused to follow the usual patterns. That evening, as she walked the palace halls, she heard again the whispers of the nobility. They said her throne was dying. They said she was nothing, more than a beautiful mask for an empty crown. Some even dared to hope for her fall, imagining how they might rise from the ashes. She kept her face calm, her stride steady, but each word burned. She had grown used to their doubt, but it still cut deep. Alone once more, she looked out at the stars. She remembered the faces of her ancestors, painted in the great hall, rulers who had commanded worlds with a single word. Would she be remembered only as the last, the one who watched the empire fade? She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, a vow no one else could hear. She would not let her people die without a fight. Somewhere beyond the reach of her vision, a human ship was making its way toward her world. A ship carrying a man who had never bowed to tradition, who spoke with honesty instead of polished lies, and who would change everything she thought was possible. She did not know it yet, But her lonely vow at the balcony was not the end of her story. It was the beginning. The human ship entered the orbit of the Calithian homeworld with little ceremony. To the Calithians it was a small vessel, plain and without the grandeur of the mighty empires. Yet its arrival drew curious eyes. Few had seen humans before, and fewer still had spoken to them. They were regarded as an unpredictable people, young compared to ancient races, but known for their strange resilience. Commander Marcus Hale was the chosen envoy. He was no nobleman, no polished courtier dressed in shimmering fabrics. He was a soldier turned diplomat, tall, broad-shouldered, with scars that told of battles survived. His uniform was plain by Calithian standards, yet he carried himself with a confidence that did not need ornaments. He had been chosen because, despite his blunt nature, he could speak honestly without losing control. The humans thought it would impress the Calithians. The humans were wrong. The palace guards eyed him with suspicion as he stepped into the grand halls. The ceilings were carved from crystal that reflected 1,000 colors, the walls covered in symbols older than human history. Marcus looked at them with curiosity, not awe, which unsettled the courtiers who watched. Most visitors bowed their heads, humbled by the sheer weight of tradition. Marcus simply walked, his boots echoing on the shining floors, his eyes steady. Princess. Elira had been warned about the envoy. Her advisors described humans as bold, sometimes too bold, with little respect for old customs. Some believed this meeting would be a waste of time. Others feared it would be an insult to the crown. Elira, however, had grown weary of the same polished flattery from alien diplomats. She wondered if the human might bring something different. When she entered the chamber, the hall went silent. Elira wore robes that shimmered with faint light, every movement graceful, every detail designed to project majesty. Marcus stood tall, unbent by ceremony. He did not fall to one knee as was expected. Instead, he offered a nod, firm and respectful in its own way. Gasps echoed through the court, whispers hissing like serpents in the air. "You stand in the presence of Princess Elira of the Eternal Crown," an official announced, his voice sharp. Marcus glanced at the official, then at Elira herself. "I know who she is," he said, his tone calm. "And I'm honored to meet her." The hall stirred with disapproval, but Elira raised her hand. Silence returned. She studied him closely. His voice carried no fear, no attempt to flatter. It was plain, almost careless, yet honest. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, though she hid it quickly. The first meeting was meant to be formal. Marcus was expected to deliver rehearsed lines about trade agreements and cultural exchange. Instead, he spoke simply about the human, wish for friendship, for learning, for survival among the stars. He admitted openly that Earth was young and inexperienced compared to her empire. He did not try to make Earth seem greater than it was. "We've stumbled," he said plainly. "We've made mistakes. But we keep moving forward. That's what we do." Elira listened in silence. His words lacked the careful poetry of alien ambassadors, but they carried weight. For the first time in years, she felt as if someone was speaking to her, not at her crown. When the session ended, courtiers muttered angrily. Some called the human insolent, others called him ignorant. Yet Elira ordered that he remain as her guest, at least for the duration of the talks. Her advisors protested, warning her that his presence would offend the nobility. But Elira silenced them. There was something in Marcus's presence she could not ignore. That evening, Marcus was escorted through the palace gardens. Strange, glowing plants shimmered under the night sky, their scent sweet and sharp. He paused often, marveling at the beauty of alien life, asking questions that no diplomat before him had bothered to ask. To him, nothing was beneath notice. Every flower, every stone, every guard was worth curiosity. Elira, watching from a balcony, found herself intrigued. Other envoys treated her world as a stage, a place to perform, never to truly see. Yet the human seemed to notice everything, even the smallest details. His bluntness, once considered an insult, now seemed like a kind of strength. Later, as she prepared for rest, she thought of his words. We keep moving forward. Simple, yet powerful. Her people had once lived by such a belief, but centuries of tradition had chained them. She wondered if this human, with his unpolished honesty, might remind her of something she had forgotten. Marcus, in his quarters, reflected on the princess. She had an air of sadness beneath her composure, a kind of loneliness that no ceremony could hide. He had met leaders before, proud, arrogant, greedy, but she was different. He did not yet understand her burdens, but he sensed their weight. He resolved quietly to treat her not as a relic of a dying empire, but as a person. Neither of them knew it yet. But the course of both their lives had already shifted. What began as a formal exchange between two worlds was the start of a bond that would shake empires and defy everything believed possible. The palace was never silent for long. Hidden within its shining walls, every shadow carried secrets, every corner carried listening ears. Princess Aelira had grown up knowing this, yet the danger always seemed distant, like a story told about someone else. That changed the night the assassins came. Marcus had been invited to a private gathering, a small dinner with members of the court, meant to ease the tension caused by his unusual behavior in the throne hall. He accepted, though he disliked the stiffness of the event. Every noble looked at him with thin smiles and sharper eyes, their words layered with meaning he had no interest in decoding. He answered them in his plain way, which only deepened their irritation. But Aelira noticed how his words, though simple, cut through their games. When the gathering ended, she walked with him through the torch-lit corridor, speaking more openly than she had before. She asked about Earth, about its seas and forests, its people and their struggles. Marcus told her about storms that swallowed cities, about wars that had left scars, about how people kept rebuilding no matter how often they fell. She listened, with quiet wonder. To her, the idea of falling and rising again was both alien and strangely comforting. Then the moment shattered. A sound sliced through the air, a whisper of movement too sharp to be natural. Marcus's instincts flared. Before he could speak, a figure leapt from the shadows, blade glinting under the pale light. Aelira froze, but Marcus moved. He was a soldier before he was ever a diplomat. He caught the attacker's wrist, twisting hard, the blade slicing his arm instead of her chest. The pain burned, but he did not let go. With a grunt, he slammed the assassin against the wall. Another came, from behind, but Marcus shoved Aelira aside, taking the strike across his shoulder. He fought with nothing but instinct and strength, no weapon in hand, only the will to protect. Guards finally rushed in, too late to prevent the attack, but quick enough to drag the surviving assassins away. Blood ran down Marcus's arm, staining his uniform, yet he remained standing, his breath sharp but steady. Aelira looked at him in shock, her heart pounding. Never before had anyone placed themselves between her and death without hesitation. Even her own guards hesitated, thinking first of their orders, their positions. But this human, this stranger, had acted without thought of himself. "You are hurt," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her effort to control it. "I've been hurt worse," he replied, wincing but still steady. "You're alive. That's what matters." Later, in the healing chambers, as light-based medicine sealed his wounds, Aelira stayed at his side. Tradition demanded that she leave such duties to servants, but she refused. She asked him why he had done it. He shrugged as if the answer was obvious. "Because it was the right thing to do. Where I come from, you protect those who can't fight back. That's just how it is." His answer struck her deeply. In her world, duty and loyalty were wrapped in ceremony and politics. Acts of courage were rare, often calculated for advantage. But Marcus had no advantage to gain. He had acted because his nature demanded it. Days passed, and during his recovery she visited him often. At first their talks were light, about Earth's food, its unpredictable weather, its strange creatures. Then the talks grew deeper. She shared her fears of being the last, of carrying a crown with no future. To her surprise, Marcus did not try to comfort her with empty words. Instead, he said, "Then maybe you find a new way forward. Curses, traditions, rules. None of those are unbreakable. They only stay unbroken because people believe they can't be changed." She stared at him, both troubled and inspired. He made it sound so simple, yet he spoke with the weight of someone who had lived through hardship and refused to surrender. His scars proved as much. The court, however, was not blind to their growing closeness. Whispers spread faster than fire. Some said the princess was lowering herself, speaking to a barbarian from a young world. Others feared his influence, calling him dangerous, a spark that might ignite rebellion in her heart. But Aelira did not care. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, not as a princess, not as a symbol, but as a person. One evening, under the glow of the palace lanterns, she asked him a question that had weighed on her for years. "Do you believe every line must end? Or can something broken still begin again?" Marcus met her gaze, his eyes steady, unshaken. "Everything ends," he said. "But endings don't mean nothing comes after. Sometimes the best beginnings are born from what everyone thought was finished." She said nothing, but in her chest a spark lit. A dangerous spark. For all her life she had been told her line was cursed, doomed to end. Yet here stood a man who believed no fate was final. That night, as she lay awake in her chamber, she realized that the human's presence was not simply an accident of diplomacy. His arrival had already changed her heart. And she knew, though she dared not yet admit it, that the bond forming between them would change far more than herself. It might change the fate of the empire. The council chamber was filled with murmurs when Princess Aelira made her announcement. Every noble, every advisor, every officer of the crown stared at her in disbelief. Some thought they had misheard. Others believed it was a cruel joke. But she stood calm at the center of the storm, her voice steady as crystal. She had chosen a consort, and his name was Marcus Hale. A human, an outsider, a man from a young world with no noble blood. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by gasps and the scraping of chairs as courtiers rose in protest. One elder shouted that such a union was impossible. Another accused the princess of losing her mind. Some even laughed, certain this could not be real. But Aelira did not waver. She repeated her words, each one sharper than the last. Marcus was the one she had chosen, and her decision was final. Marcus himself was caught off guard. He had known their bond was growing, that her trust in him had deepened, but he had not expected this. He had not asked for power, nor for a crown. Yet when he looked at her, he saw not a ruler making a political choice, but a woman making a personal one. She was tired of lies, tired of traditions that caged her. He understood her choice was more than marriage. It was rebellion against fate itself. The protests spread beyond the chamber. In the streets of the capital, citizens argued. Some mocked the idea of a human joining their royal line. Others whispered with curiosity, wondering if this meant hope after all. For years, everyone had believed her bloodline would end. Now, she was daring to challenge that truth. The palace shook with tension, guards on edge while rival houses prepared to turn the scandal into opportunity. Despite the chaos, Aelira moved forward with the ceremony. She refused to delay or reconsider. If her people thought her weak, she would show them strength in the most shocking way. Preparations were made quickly. The great hall was filled with shimmering lights. The banners of her ancestors spread wide, across the walls. Musicians played ancient songs, though many hands trembled on their instruments. Marcus stood at her side, dressed in garments offered by the court, robes of silver thread that felt awkward on his shoulders. He preferred his plain uniform, but Aelira had smiled at him when he wore them, and that was enough. He walked with her down the long aisle of crystal, feeling the eyes of thousands piercing his back. He was not a noble. He was not one of them. But he did not bow or break. He held himself as he always did, simple, steady, unshaken. When they stood before the ancient altar, the priest hesitated. His voice faltered as he spoke the words that bound bloodlines together. Never before in recorded history had such a ritual been performed with an outsider. The priest glanced at the nobles, then at Aelira. She raised her chin, her eyes sharp as blades, and ordered him to continue. The vows were spoken. Elira's voice rang clear, steady as the stars. Marcus's was firm, though less polished, carrying the weight of a man who meant every word he said. When the final mark was placed upon their hands, sealing the bond, the hall erupted. Some cried in fury, some in disbelief, and some in quiet awe. What was thought impossible had just been made real. Afterward, when the crowd dispersed, Elira led Marcus to the balcony that overlooked the city. Fires of celebration and protest both burned in the distance, but she did not look away. She asked him softly if he regretted it, stepping into a storm that could cost him his life. He shook his head. "I don't regret standing with you," he said. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Her heart stirred at his words. For years she had been surrounded by people who only saw her as a crown, a symbol. Marcus saw her as a person. That truth gave her courage she had not known she possessed. But beyond the balcony, dangers were already rising. Rival houses plotted, in secret. Enemies outside the empire saw weakness in the scandal. And within the palace itself, whispers turned into threats. Many believed the union would bring nothing but disaster, that no child could ever be born of such a pairing. Elira, however, held to her choice. She did not know what the future would bring, but she knew this. Her people needed more than tradition. They needed hope, even if it came from the most unexpected place. And Marcus, the human who had stepped between her and death, was the only one who gave her that hope. As the night deepened and the stars stretched above, the princess and the human stood side by side. Neither of them could see the storm that was coming, nor the miracle that would soon defy the galaxy. But in that moment, they were united, not just by ritual, but by the unshakable bond of two hearts choosing each other against all odds. The weeks after the union were uneasy. The empire had not calmed. Some citizens cheered for their princess, praising her courage to break chains of tradition. Others muttered that she had disgraced her crown by taking a human consort. In the high halls of power, rivals sharpened their knives, waiting for proof that Elira's choice would bring only ruin. The strongest argument against her union was always the same. No child would ever come of it. The curse of her bloodline had endured for centuries, and even if that curse were not real, no one believed two such different species could create life together. To the nobles, Marcus was a distraction, a symbol of desperation. They were certain that time would expose him as nothing more. But then one morning, Elira called her private healers. For days she had felt changes in her body, small but undeniable. The healers scanned her with light and song, their instruments ancient and exact. At first they were silent, their faces pale as though they could not believe what they saw. Then they knelt before her, their voices trembling. The impossible had happened. She was with child. Elira sat frozen. For so long she had carried the weight of being the last, believing her line would end with her. The idea of carrying an heir had become a dream so distant it was painful to imagine. Yet here it was, life stirring within her, a spark that defied every whisper of doom. Marcus learned of it that evening. She told him quietly, her voice soft and uncertain, almost afraid to believe her own words. He stood silent for a moment, then smiled. Not the careful smile of a courtier, but the wide, honest smile of a man who had faced countless battles and still found joy. "Then the galaxy was wrong," he said simply, "and we were right to try." News spread quickly despite her effort to keep it secret at first. Whispers traveled faster than light in the palace halls. By the next day, the entire court was alive with shock. Some nobles shouted it was a lie, an illusion crafted by the princess to buy time. Others demanded proof, sending their own scholars to confirm. When the truth could no longer be denied, the empire erupted. For the people in the streets, the news carried hope. Mothers held their children closer, saying that if the curse could be broken, then perhaps their own hardships could also end. Songs began to rise in the lower districts, songs that spoke of rebirth and renewal. But in the high towers of rival houses, the reaction was darker. If the princess truly bore an heir, then all their plans to claim the throne would crumble. That child would not only inherit the empire, it would symbolize the survival of a dynasty thought lost forever. Plots thickened, hidden blades were sharpened, alliances whispered in shadow. Some spoke of ending the union before the child was born. Others went further, imagining that if the child itself were destroyed, the hope of the empire would fall with it. Elira, aware of the danger, tightened her guards. Marcus, however, trusted little in walls or noble promises. He began to train with the palace soldiers, teaching them human tactics, methods of defense that relied less on ritual and more on instinct. His ways were strange to the Calithians, but they quickly saw the value in his experience. Through it all, Elira carried herself with calm grace. Yet, in her private moments, she touched her stomach and whispered to the life inside. She promised her child that they would be safe no matter what storm came. For the first time in her life, she felt that her existence had true purpose. She was no longer only the last of her line. She was the bridge to something new. One evening, standing on the balcony with Marcus at her side, she looked out over the glowing city. Fires of protest still burned in some quarters while celebrations echoed in others. The empire was divided, shaken, uncertain. She asked him quietly, "Will they accept it? Will they accept us?" Marcus rested his hand over hers. "They'll have to," he said, "because this child is proof that their rules don't matter as much as they think. Life finds a way, it always does." His words gave her strength. She knew the days ahead would not be easy. Assassins would come again. Rivals would grow desperate. Entire worlds might turn against them. But with every risk came the promise of something greater, a future no one believed possible. And so the empire entered a new age of waiting for the birth of a child that would either save them or bring the greatest war in their history. In every corner of the galaxy, eyes turned toward the Calithian throne. Some watched with hope. Others watched with hatred. But all of them agreed on one thing. If the child was born, nothing would ever be the same again. The night was heavy with silence before the storm. Princess Elira's child was close to being born, and the empire held its breath. Across the stars, loyal citizens prayed for their future, while enemies sharpened their blades. To the rival houses, this was their last chance. If the child lived, their hopes of stealing the throne would vanish. If the child died, the empire would fracture and they could rise from the ashes. The first strike came when the palace shields were sabotaged. In the deep hours before dawn, explosions rocked the outer defenses. Towers of crystal burned and soldiers rushed to their posts. Alarms screamed across the capital. Marcus Hale was already awake, his instincts sharpened by years of war. He knew this was no small attack. It was a coup, a final desperate attempt to end the royal line before it could begin again. He did not waste time. He gathered the loyal guards and trained them quickly in the methods he had shown them before. Fight smart, not just proud. The Calithians were used to ritualized combat, duels, and honor-bound formations. But Marcus taught them to move in shadows, to set traps, to strike where the enemy least expected. He reminded them that survival mattered more than tradition. Tonight, survival meant everything. In her chamber, Elira tried to stay calm as the sounds of battle grew louder. The healers surrounded her, preparing for the birth. Pain came in waves, sharp and relentless, but she refused to cry out. She would not let fear see her broken. Yet in her heart, she worried for Marcus. She knew he would stand in the thick of the fight, and she prayed the gods would not take him from her. The coup forces swept through the palace with ruthless speed. They wore the colors of rival houses, their weapons glowing with forbidden energy. They killed without hesitation, cutting down loyal soldiers, storming the halls with one goal: to reach the princess before the child could be born. But at every turn, they met resistance that surprised them. Marcus led the defense with unyielding determination. He used the palace's narrow passages to his advantage, forcing the attackers into choke points. He had the guards overturn tables, block halls with debris, and set traps that caught the enemy off guard. "Don't fight their way," he shouted over the clash of blades. "Fight our way. Use everything. Break every rule if it keeps her alive." The guards obeyed, and slowly the tide shifted. Where the attackers expected quick victory, they found themselves slowed, bloodied, and divided. Marcus fought alongside them, his rifle in hand, his body moving with the precision of a man who had faced death too many times to count. Wounds opened on his arms and shoulders, but he pushed forward, each strike fueled by one thought: Elira and the child must survive. In the birthing chamber, the walls trembled as battle raged closer. Elira's breaths came hard, her body straining with the effort of bringing new life into the world. The healers urged her to stay strong, their voices tense with fear. She clenched her fists and whispered to her unborn child, promising that they would see the dawn together. The final wave of attackers reached the chamber doors. Marcus and a handful of guards stood in their way. The air was thick with smoke and blood, the floor littered with the fallen. Marcus planted himself at the center, refusing to step back. The enemy surged forward and steel met steel, light met fire. Marcus fought like a man possessed, every strike fueled by love and duty. He knew he might die here, but if he could hold the line long enough, it would be worth it. Inside, a cry pierced the chaos. The child was born. The healers raised their voices in awe, declaring the air alive. The sound carried through the halls like a beacon. For a moment, even the battle seemed to pause. The impossible had happened. The bloodline had continued. That pause was all Marcus needed. With a roar, he drove the attackers back, his blade cutting through their defense. The loyal guards surged with him, their spirits renewed by the news. They fought with the strength of men and women defending not only their ruler but their future. The coup forces, shaken and desperate, began to falter. One by one, they fell or fled until the halls of the palace were littered with their defeat. Exhausted and bloodied, Marcus leaned against the doorframe, his breath ragged. He could barely stand, but he forced himself into the chamber. There, on a bed of shimmering silk, Elira cradled the newborn. Her face was pale with exhaustion, but her eyes shone brighter than the stars. She looked at Marcus and whispered, "We did it." He stepped closer, his heart heavy with relief. The child was small, fragile, yet alive, half human, half Calithian, and proof that the galaxy's rules could be broken. Marcus touched the child's hand gently, feeling its tiny fingers curl around his own. For the first time in his life, he felt that every battle, every scar had been worth it. Outside, the Empire stirred with new hope. The child's birth was more than succession. It was a symbol of survival, a promise that the future could be different from the past. Songs rose in the streets, louder than the cries of protest. And in the shadows, those who had plotted against the crown realized their time was over. The cradle of war had been defended, the heir had been born, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The Empire awoke to a new dawn. The cries of battle had faded, leaving behind silence heavy with both grief and hope. The palace walls still bore the scars of the coup. Smoke lingered in the sky, and rubble marked the streets. But the people's eyes were no longer filled with despair. They had seen something they believed was impossible. The princess had lived. The child had been born. For the first time in centuries, the throne had an heir. The news spread across the empire faster than any fleet could fly. Merchants shouted it in markets, soldiers whispered it at their posts, and children repeated it in the alleys like a song. From the outer colonies to the heart of the capital, one truth began to echo. The curse was broken. Elira held her newborn close in the quiet hours after the chaos. The baby's eyes glowed faintly, carrying the shimmer of Calithian blood but also the warmth of something new. She felt the tiny heartbeat against her chest, steady and strong. She whispered promises to her child, promises of safety, of love, of a future that would not be bound by the chains that had trapped her for so long. Marcus sat nearby, his body covered in fresh bandages. He was weary, his strength nearly spent, yet his eyes never left them. In all his life he had seen war bring only destruction. But here he saw something born out of it. Life, fragile but full of power. He thought of his own world, of Earth, and how its people always pushed forward despite every hardship. This child was proof that such will could change not only one world, but an empire. Outside the palace, celebrations grew. Banners of light filled the skies, and songs rose from the common people. Yet not all voices joined in joy. The nobles who had plotted against Elira gathered in secret, their faces pale with defeat. Their coup had failed, and their lies had been shattered by the child's birth. Some still whispered of rebellion, but many understood the truth. Their time had ended. The people's hearts belonged once again to their princess. The council called for a great assembly to present the heir to the empire. Elira agreed, though her body still ached with the pain of birth. She knew the people needed to see the child with their own eyes, to believe fully in what had happened. On the day of the assembly, the great hall was filled beyond measure. Nobles, soldiers, merchants, and even farmers from distant worlds came to witness the moment. The air was thick with anticipation, every breath held in silence. At last, Elira entered, wearing robes of pure white, the child in her arms. Marcus walked at her side, his steps firm despite his wounds. The crowd bowed low, but their eyes rose quickly to see. Elira raised her child high, the light of the hall shining down upon them. Gasps echoed like thunder, followed by a wave of cheers, so loud it shook the crystal walls. Tears filled the eyes of old soldiers who had believed they would die without an heir to follow. Mothers lifted their children, telling them to remember this day forever. In that moment, the empire was no longer divided. For the first time in generations, it had something greater than tradition to believe in. It had hope. Elira spoke, her voice carrying across the hall. She told her people that the curse was broken, that the future was alive, and that their empire would rise again. She did not speak of old glory or lost power, but of renewal, of strength born from change. This child, she said, is proof that nothing is final, not curses, not fate, not even the end of a line. From what was thought impossible, life has come. Her words sank deep into every heart, and beside her Marcus stood silent but proud. The courtiers who once mocked him now saw the truth. This human had given their empire a chance to live. His name would be remembered as the one who had defied the stars themselves. As the assembly ended and the people returned to their homes, Elira and Marcus stood together at the balcony once more. The city below glowed with firelight. But this time, the flames were not of war. They were lanterns lit in celebration, filling the sky with 1,000 lights. Elira leaned gently against Marcus, her child sleeping in her arms. "We have given them hope," she whispered. Marcus nodded. "And now we protect it. Always." They stood in silence, watching the lights drift higher, like stars being born. They knew challenges would come, rivals would still scheme, enemies would still wait beyond the borders. But for the first time they did not feel alone. They had each other, and they had their child. That was enough to face whatever tomorrow brought. The galaxy would remember the night the heir was born. Not as the end of a dying empire, but as the birth of a new age, an age where humans and Calithians together rewrote destiny. And at the heart of it all, a princess who had refused to surrender, a human who had dared to stand by her, and a child whose first cry had changed the stars forever.